Hi, welcome to Write More Light. My name is Sarah, um, coming to you from the Midwest Writing Center's location in my house. Um, Today, we're going to talk about vulnerability. Last week, I talked with a friend who is new to workshop about how to be vulnerable in a workshop setting. Today, we're going to talk about how to foster it, how to nurture it, and how to feel safe when you're putting yourself on the line. Um, Later on in April, we'll do a video on my first workshop, which will be like, if you're new to workshopping, what to expect, how to come prepared. But today we're going to talk about how to be vulnerable and how to feel safe while being vulnerable. At the end of the little lesson, the little discussion with myself, I'll let you know what's up, current events, new and upcoming things with the Midwest Writing Center. Then we'll do a free write. So thank you for joining me, and let's get vulnerable. I feel like now there should be a montage the way I said that, like a title card. No, not for you. So the reason it's difficult to be vulnerable in a workshop setting is that our egos are so wrapped up in our art, and that's something that like if you're doing something that has rules and specificity, there's a certain way to do X, and you always do X, and you always get X result, right? But in art, and generally my focus is on writing, because we're a writing center, but in art there are very few rules, if any. That's an argument I'm not going to get into. And as such, our egos are really, really wrapped up in that. When I say ego in this context, I mean our identity, right? When I write something, even if it's fiction, even if it's speculative, that came out of me. And as such, if you say something that I hear as negative about it, whether or not what you're saying is intended as negative, it hurts my feelings. And that's why it sucks to be vulnerable. That's why you don't want to be vulnerable. You don't want to put your own identity, your own self, your ego on the line. That makes it really, 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 really difficult in general. But then in a traditional workshop method, and I will define that in a moment, you're releasing control, and you're releasing power to a bunch of other people. This is a piece that came out of you, and then you're presenting it to people with no explanation. You're not allowed to give background information, and you're not allowed to answer questions, even if questions come up, and you're allowing for this process that these readers are the experts on your work. And that's really, really hard. Even if, you accept that premise and you go into it, and then people are just like really misinterpreting your work, it's really hard to hear. No matter how confident you are, no matter how secure you are in your work, like, people misunderstanding is hard. And there are various workshop methods, and there are various ways to understand feedback or receive feedback from someone misunderstanding your work. And I'll get into that later, probably in my first workshop video. But if someone misunderstands your work, there's a variety of ways to take that. Sometimes it's cultural. Again, that's for a different time. Sometimes it's because your writing was unclear, but that makes it really hard. Like, knowing that going into something, and knowing that there's a good possibility that people are people will be critical of you, but sometimes that's insulting. People, we have to trust they don't mean it as an insult, but it feels that way a lot of the time. And to willingly and openly put yourself in a situation in which you might get hurt, like, that's what vulnerability is, right? And that's why it's hard in any situation. But with art in particular, our identities are wrapped up in our work, and they don't need to be. That's something I will get to in a moment. But gosh, especially when it's new people, uh, you don't know them, so you don't trust them, right? Or we often make the mistake of assuming someone's. I'm very guilty of this, and it is garbage, and I know it, and I'm working on it, or at least I know better, and therefore I talk myself out of it. But we often make the mistake of judging someone's skill at reading and giving feedback as the same as their skill as a writer. So if you and our determination of someone's skill as an artist is often based upon our own taste and not something objective, right? It's very, very arbitrary. It's very much based on my own taste. So if I don't like your work, doesn't mean it's not good or bad. I mean, it doesn't mean it's good or bad, but I'm going to therefore say, well, I don't like your work, and therefore I don't respect your feedback. And that's not that's not how it works. Somebody whose work is very different from your own, someone whose work you don't like, and also someone whose work isn't good. That doesn't mean they can't provide feedback. That doesn't mean that they're not an excellent reader, and it doesn't mean that they're not the perfect ally for you. It took me a long time to figure out that my taste is not objective. And I've sort of tried to train myself, and maybe I'll make a video on this too, to see quality versus taste. Those are very different things, and really, really important to separate when you're in a workshop setting, because we do have that tendency to say, well, I don't like it, therefore it's not, therefore the creator of it isn't relevant to me. And that's just not the case, especially since, and this is a totally different like theory conversation, but all art is in conversation with each other. So whether or not it's your taste, it still exists, maybe of quality, and is definitely relevant. So how do we foster trust among strangers or among people whose work is different from our own? How do we give ourselves over to trust and make ourselves vulnerable? Obviously that's why it's hard, because it's complicated. It's difficult to do these things. I want to say that the most important thing from the start, I'm going to be going a little out of order. I didn't manage to put my notes in the order I wanted to present in. I opted for eating lunch instead of organizing, but ideally you'll enter into a workshop setting, and either at the beginning of the workshop or somewhere in advance, like posted, there will be ground rules and an introduction of workshop style. So first, let's do a little cliff notes of what workshop means. That's a weird word, because we sometimes mean it as a verb and we sometimes mean it as a noun, and often, and also the noun has two meanings, right? So workshop in this context means a group of people together for criticism. And again, criticism is not necessarily negative. It's we're evaluating each other's work and trying to help each other. So in this context, when I say workshop, I mean you're in a group of people who are looking at each other's work and trying to help each other. Oftentimes in my job at the center, we talk about workshop and what we mean is class, totally different things. So I guess those are both nouns, right? Getting together in a group, and the group is called a workshop. And in that workshop, you provide feedback to one another. That's a noun. But then we say workshopping, that's the verb, which is giving criticism, giving feedback, interacting with one another. And then the other noun, of course, is a class that we call a workshop, because it's more interactive, more, community-centered, right? There's more to it than like a lecture. And that's why in the arts, we use the word workshop instead of class a lot of the time, but they're really interchangeable, more or less. Okay, so now we've defined our terms. Workshop is the group in which we give feedback to one another on our art. So generally speaking, the most widely accepted, widely embraced form of workshop is the Iowa workshop method, in which I as the person who's being criticized, person who's being workshopped, um, I give you my work either in advance or I read it to you in the workshop setting, and then I am silent. I give no information up front. I give no information afterwards. And then my readers have taken notes. They've prepared something to say to me. They've collected their thoughts, and they give me feedback. And I don't say anything. I don't respond to what they say. I take notes on what they say, and then, I go home, I think about it, I revise. Excuse me, there are lots of other workshop methods, and I will also get into that. Ryan and I talked about it in a video on getting the most out of workshop, but I'm going to do a video later on workshop methods, because there are many. And because there are so many, there are many different ways to interpret feedback, and there are many different ways to give feedback, and there's a whole world out there of methods, but the traditional one is the one I've just described. And in that setting, it's, I think, also more difficult to allow yourself vulnerability and to hear the feedback, because you're just letting these people be the experts on something that came out of you. And a lot of the times, if there's something they don't understand, it's cultural, or it's personal, and it's not that you did it wrong, right? And that's what some of the criticism will be. Like, I don't understand this, so it needs to be fixed and clarified. And that's not necessarily the case. So, you need to know how to take feedback, which is difficult. And it's a skill that you have to hone, because you are the expert on your own work. And when you go into a workshop, you're giving that away. You're giving that expertise over to someone else. And so it's really important to know how to do that, which is why we're here. I've skipped ahead. So ideally, we know in advance what kind of workshop we're going to, and what the ground rules are. Like, am I allowed to tell you what information I need from this workshop, from your reading of my work? Am I allowed to answer questions if someone poses them? And then there will be some kind of community contract, which is not so much like when you're in a proper meeting, or like a work group or whatever, but more like, how do we know who reads? How do we know how to give feedback? Ground rules. So when we are taking feedback, when we're trying to figure out how to be vulnerable in this group of strangers, or a group of people whose work doesn't line up with my own, or who come from different culture, here are some tips and tricks. If you can, separate yourself from the work. If it's a really emotional piece, if it's really raw, if it's new, maybe sit on it. Maybe don't bring it to workshop until you have some distance from it, because if you really are wrapped up in the piece, if it is really a strong part of your identity, if there's a lot of feelings, if it's a response to something that happened recently in life, it's hard to take feedback and understand that it's not a criticism of you, but a criticism of the work. That's another thing too. It's really hard to understand that the work is not you. So in order to separate ourselves from the work, in order to understand that though you created the work is not you, it's really, really useful to not bring fresh pieces, especially if they're really emotional. If it's like an experiment, or like definitely fiction and just rough enough that you're really like, you want some help with direction, cool. But if it's really, really personal, maybe sit on it for a while before you bring it to a workshop, just so that you are separate from the work. It's I had a professor once who called this the spit test, and it was a really strange exercise, actually. I understand the concept, right? And the concept is that you are not your work. But it's just, you need to have enough distance from it that if it takes debris, you understand that, physically, right? If this is my work, I crumple it up and I throw it down. What falls on this is not falling on me. If you don't have that kind of distance, it's painful to take criticism. Then my second piece of advice is harder. It's harder because it requires time. And I think I think most of us lack that, right? We have lives, and the fact that we have time to do this workshop is like, that's my me time, right? That's the thing I'm affording myself is this time. So it's hard to take time in advance. But it's important to reflect ahead of workshop. Even, maybe you're reflecting in the shower or on your commute, but it's important to reflect in advance on what do you need from workshop when you're giving this work over to accept feedback. What kind of feedback do you want? Now, maybe you won't be able to specifically state that in the workshop, but you need to know it so that you can decide what feedback to take and what feedback to leave. And sometimes, you get feedback that isn't what you're looking for and it's still helpful. Sometimes you get feedback that isn't what you're looking for and it's not helpful. But knowing what kind of feedback you're looking for makes a huge difference. I already said this. You need to reflect in advance. Do you have emotional distance from the piece? That's a hard one, but usually you can determine it easily. But that doesn't mean, you write this piece and it's emotional and it's raw and you're really excited that you created it. You think you did some really great stuff with language or form. And so you want to show people, you want to get feedback. But if you're not ready, like, you need to be able to determine if you're not ready. So like, imagine someone talking about it. And if that is upsetting, then you're not ready. Don't like abuse yourself. Don't sit there and be like, well, what if somebody said that this sucked? But you've heard people give feedback before, constructive feedback. And so if you can imagine somebody saying, this is good, but can you tell me about this line break? How, like, are you going to be defensive? Will it hurt your feelings to have somebody say the line break is hard to understand? Things to consider. You want to know in advance what parts of the piece you're married to. By that, I mean unwilling to change. What is your favorite thing about this piece? What is the bedrock of the piece? I mean, maybe there isn't one. Maybe it's just that new or that experimental, and you really just want to know if it works. That's fine. But reflect on that, know in advance, what parts am I unwilling to change? And if somebody has some criticism on that, listen to them. But okay, so I'll give an example from my own life that I think I've given before, but it was pretty recent, so it's a good one for me to keep bringing up. I am writing this really pretty experimental piece in which I give both driving directions and song lyrics. And that's the most important part of the piece for me. That's what, for me, grounds the piece. That's what makes it the weird and cool piece that I think it is. And I received feedback from two different people who told me one told me to get rid of the lyrics and one told me to get rid of the driving directions. And I was comfortable enough to know in myself, those are the only thing I'm not willing to change. If the language is weird, if the rest of the piece doesn't work, that would suck. But I'm willing to do other work. I'm willing to change the way I use the lyrics and the directions. I'm willing to move around with it, but I'm not willing to give up those two elements. And I know that. I know that that's what makes the piece special to me as its creator. And so I was able to ignore that advice without turmoil. I thought about it. Somebody had specific criticism of an artist or a song that I referenced because, and I've heard this before, when someone knows a song, if it's a well-known song, they have their own feelings, their own experience with it. And you don't want that to, you want your own tone, your own emotional reference coming across. So that could affect the piece, right? In fact, I know Daniel Handler, he's a famous author. He's also Lemony Snicket, same person. He does a lot of film and music and opera references in his work, and he always entirely fabricates them. They're just fictional operas, films, music, so that no one can tell him he's wrong or tell his characters he's wrong. They're wrong. And that's valid and lovely and just not what I'm going for. It's great advice depending on your situation, but it's not what I'm going for. So know what you're married to, know what you're not married to. Do you know, this is a new one, do you know where the piece is going? Do you know if the piece is complete? You don't have to. You don't have to know these things, but you need to know whether or not you know them. A lot of the time, I'll bring something for feedback because I don't know where it's going. And maybe, someone else's reading of it will tell me, this is your interpretation. And now I know, like, this is how people see it. So that helps me know what direction I want it to go in and or how to get there. Even if I don't like their perspective, that gives me an idea of what I want. So do you know where it's going? Do you know if it's complete? Another one, do you have an audience in mind? So I always say, don't worry about an audience until the piece is done. You can't have an audience if there's nothing to read or consume. But now you've finished it, or at least finished it enough to workshop. Who do you have in mind for it now? Now you're allowed to think about it. Don't think about it too much because you will be doing edits and you will be working more on it. So don't be married to this audience, but because that'll just get inside your head. But where would you like it to be published? Who would you like to read it? Who are you, right? Like if you are your own reader, what demographic is that? What experience are they coming from? I know, shout out, I hope this is not weird for me to share. I know our MWC friend, Skylar Alexander, had, when working on her book, a specific human in mind for who her audience would be once she compiled her book, which is complete, by the way, coming to you soon. And so when she was making edits and putting things in order, etc., she was like, okay, well, would this person get a kick out of this? Would this person love this? Would this person be affected? Would this resonate? And that's, not universal advice. Don't just like pick someone, but maybe a caricature of a person, or like I have this rule for myself where if I'm unwilling to tell my grandchildren or grandparents about it, grandparents is a poor example, they're no longer with us, then I probably shouldn't do the thing. It's a bit like that. Also, good life advice. If you're going to be ashamed about it later, maybe don't do it. So it's a bit like that. Have just someone in mind who would make a good audience. It can be a caricature, it can be a TV character. But once you're working on edits, once you're taking feedback, is the person giving you feedback someone who would belong to your audience? Maybe. Maybe the audience isn't even who you thought it would be. These are opportunities to learn. Anything that you get from workshop is an opportunity to learn. And it's, you can go in there with expectations. You can go in there with stuff in mind. Like, I know what I'm married to. I know where I think the piece is going. I know who I think my audience is. And then from receiving feedback, that stuff changes. And that's great. That's another reason that vulnerability is good in workshop, and something that we really need to foster, is because we're going to, when we can open ourselves up that way, we're going to find out a lot more about the piece and be able to do better for the piece. So And that's another bit of, how to let go of your ego is in just separating from the piece, um, and knowing what you want. If it's allowed to state in your workshop what kind of feedback you want and need, it's important to say that in advance. Um, when you give out your work, when you read your work to the other workshoppers, it's important to say in advance, here is the feedback I'm looking for, if that's something that you're prepared to do. Um, Building trust is probably the other hard part of vulnerability. It is really awkward because this is such a vulnerable process. So these people are getting, even if you're relatively stoic and confident and an expert on how to simultaneously shield yourself and be vulnerable. Having strangers, having people, you only know in a certain context, give feedback is really hard, and learning to trust them in this context is really hard. And the way we do that is by opening ourselves up to the feedback, and also by being honest and thoughtful in the way that we give feedback. So there's a bit of advice that I give too is if you're new to the workshop, don't go first. Granted, that doesn't always work. I often will volunteer as tribute to get the awkward out of the way. um, but the way that you can help foster trust by not going first is by giving really thoughtful feedback, paying attention, taking notes, and setting an example by being the person who gives the feedback you want. Ask questions rather than making statements. If you're like, this is a bad example. Generally, criticizing word choice is a no-no, but instead of saying, I don't like that you used that word there, or I think this is poor word choice, you can say, can you tell me why you chose that word? And that will both give you information as the reader, and it will also require that the person presenting their work, the writer, has to be intentional and think about their work. And when you give feedback, you can foster trust between you and the writer by being a really good reader and by being thoughtful and intentional with the feedback that you give. And then those people will do the same for you, presumably. Because you've shown that you're willing to do this, because you've shown that you're dedicated to this, you've shown that you're intentional and caring in how you engage. And generally, when people feel respected, they respect back. Then, in addition to that, by not going first, you can feel out the group. You can see how they all respond to each other, what the dynamic is, how they give feedback, so that you can sort of interpret based on, we all just read this piece and here's how this person replied. So I know probably that's how they'll reply to me. And then you're a little more prepared. Reasons that it's awkward when it's new people or people you don't know in this context, and how to figure out how to trust them. You don't have to trust their expertise. So that's another way to be helpful with your ego and your vulnerability. You don't have to trust their expertise on your work. You don't have to respect their expertise. You are the creator, but you must respect that you have asked for their perspective. Maybe not them specifically, but you brought a piece here and you wanted someone's perspective who is not you. And they brought that and they're giving you the best feedback that they are capable of. So you must be respectful of them, of their position, of the fact that they're doing you a favor. Even if you don't like what they say, even if you don't agree with what they say, even if they're clearly from a different background or something, and therefore cannot understand the piece in the way that you intend. It's really, really important to keep in mind that when you're in a workshop group, you're all doing favors for each other. This is a generous act, and this is an emotional act. This is something that, takes energy and commitment. So it's really important to remember when someone gives you feedback, they're doing you a favor. I would say, you don't have to remember that when you give feedback, because that can lead to you like feeling ripped off or something. And you don't want that. You want to just, gosh, Ryan says something really, really beautiful. Just to give in the spirit of helpfulness and receive in the spirit of helpfulness, I believe. I'm paraphrasing. But, always know that the people that you're there with are trying to be helpful, and you should do the same. It needs to be like a very equal situation. You need to give them the investment that you want from them. I've really said most of that already, looking at my notes. It's easy to reject someone's opinion from just one comment, but it's important to remember that they're still a sample audience. Maybe they're not, maybe what you got felt flippant, what you received felt flippant, or like you definitely feel like they didn't get it, or, they commented on the one thing that you're married to, but they are a sample audience. You may not know who your audience is yet. You may not need an audience. But this is a representative from a group of people. And, that may tell you like, this isn't the right audience for my work, or it may tell you I need to make adjustments so that I am accessible to this group. Again, you're the person who knows your work best. So you're the person who can make those decisions. But I encourage you to mull over it. Don't dismiss it out of hand. Take notes, and sit with it, revisit it, and discard it later if you discard it. I know, and I'll get into this when we talk about workshop styles at a different time. But there was a workshop method that I was a part of where people, this was for prose writing, fiction specifically, and people would retell you a scene or a section or your whole story. And from that, you are to understand what stuck with them or what they misinterpreted. And it's a pretty cool method. It's not my favorite, but it does tell you without using any qualifiers. It doesn't tell you without saying good or bad, without any value judgments. People are responding to you. They're giving you their understanding of a section or whatever struck them. And that's cool. That's useful. But it's harder to take note from that. You can either be like, cool, they told it back to me right, so I guess I told it right. Or, you can see, hey, more people responded to this one part, which means that's the strongest piece, whatever. But take the note and sit on it, discard it later. You don't have to discard it now. You don't have to discard it ever. Yeah. There are many workshop methods that we will talk about later. Things that are important for you to know in advance of getting vulnerable, or to shield your feelings, or when you're joining a new group or an old group that maybe you have too much history with, right? That you just like, you got comfortable or complacent, or you're having some internal conflict about them. Here's some stuff to bring with you when you ask someone to workshop your piece. How much time can you commit to interpreting the feedback you receive? Because that's part of the editing process, and that's part of the writing process. If you're asking for feedback, you need to be able to interpret the feedback. And sometimes that's not what it seems at face value. Like I was just saying with that workshop method where people tell you your story back to you, I didn't realize that something was unclear until, like 2 days into mulling over I was in art school, I had time, into mulling over the feedback I got because somebody just told me the story wrong. And I was like, cool, she wasn't listening, but she was listening. I was unclear. She didn't process something the way I wanted her to because I was unclear. Um, so know how much time you can commit to interpreting feedback. If you're looking for good, honest, thoughtful feedback, it's important to be good and honest and thoughtful when you're looking at the feedback and working on revisions. Do you know what style of feedback works best for you? This is a big and exciting and controversial thing right now, which I like. I love when there are changes in the way we do things in art. So you may have only experienced one kind of feedback. You may have only been in one kind of workshop, and this seems like a really weird thing to think about because you haven't experienced other workshops. But I think really that means that it's time to explore the other options, right? So that you know what kind of feedback is best for you. I personally, I like when people ask me questions because it forces me to be the person to give me feedback, and then I can't be mad at you. Right. So if you do ask me, why did you put this section here rather than here, then I have to think about it rather than you telling me this section should go here. And then I'm just like, you're wrong. When you ask me about it, I have to figure out if that was intentional. I have to figure out how it would look in other ways. And sometimes I'm not very thoughtful if I don't have to be. So I know that being asked questions is a better method for me personally. I didn't used to be that way. I used to want you to just be really, really blunt with me and tell me, as someone I respect, as someone who I think is a good writer, someone who I think is a good reader, tell me what I did wrong. I'm not that person anymore. And if you come at me like that, I will probably think you have an ego. And that's, maybe unfair. Maybe that's just the only way that you've ever given feedback, is just by being really blunt and saying, this feels wrong. This doesn't go here. This clearly goes here. And you're being as thoughtful and kind and generous as you know how to be, but it's just not the style that works best for me. Luckily, I'm pretty good at being criticized. So I'm not going to be insulted if you come at me like that. Maybe come at me is not the right phrasing. But some people would be, that'll make a lot of people insecure. It'll make a lot of people nervous. So it's good to know what style of feedback works best for you so that you can tell the people who are giving you feedback. Of course, depending on the workshop method that you're using, that may not work out, but usually it does. If you're not in a classroom or in a, very structured environment, if you're just meeting with other writers who want to meet with writers who want feedback, you can say that. You can say, hey, I'm about to present my piece. Here is the advice I want, and here is how I prefer to receive feedback. And that's hard. I say that I prefer to receive feedback in the form of questions, but it's hard. It's hard to do that. I find myself trying to do it, and what I usually say is, I wonder, and that's fine. I'm trying. But it's important to know, be straightforward about your needs, but also know that people are trying. If it's your first time with a group, this is something else that's important to know. If it's your first time with a group, can you ask questions in advance? Am I allowed to, when I'm presenting my work, say, this is the kind of feedback I want from you? Or, how do you normally do things? Yeah, I've covered that. Another thing to know in advance is how emotionally attached you are to the piece, and if you're able to, shield your feelings or give them over. So there's two different things. You can block off your ego, or you can soften. And I don't know what works best for you. I do it both ways, depending on the piece, depending on how long I've been working on it, depending how much structure there is to the piece. The piece I referenced earlier that has the weird format, it has the driving directions and the lyrics. I've done both ways. I've gone in there with, no emotion and just taking what you'll give me. And I've also come out or gone into a workshop setting with that piece and been very much like, I need to hear this as an emotional creature who, is the creator of this piece, who has feelings and wants them to be part of this piece. I have a stylistic issue a lot of the time, which is that I like write in a very vulnerable place, and then my pieces come out sounding very emotionless. I'm working on it. um, and so depending on the piece, I need to figure out where I am with it and change up the process so that I can get the most out of it, so that I can make the most out of it. I think I already said to give a really emotional piece some time before you share it. Only you will know when it's ready. You don't want to wait forever. But another thing to know in advance of workshop, can you pretend you're not the writer? As a general rule, when you are reading something, you never assume the narrator is the writer. And so it's really important to recognize that. Just because it says I, just because it feels like nonfiction, just because I don't know, you assume that all poetry is about the poet. Doesn't mean that that's true. And also you can't read it that way, and you can't receive feedback as if people are talking about you. Maybe the piece is about you. Maybe it is nonfiction. Maybe it's a poem about an illness you had, but your reader doesn't know that. Your reader does not know it's about you and is not giving feedback about you as a human. So can you distance yourself that way? Can you remember, if this were someone else, we would be talking about the narrator, not the writer. If you can't do that, then the piece is maybe a little too raw or too personal or whatever. And then this is the hardest one, and I don't even necessarily advise that people do it because it's a huge commitment. But do you have time to commit to the self-work involved in separating yourself from your writing and knowing how to receive feedback? Because it's an emotional process. I roll my eyes because it's annoying, and honestly, I don't I don't have the time or I don't know, commitment to commit to working on myself in advance of receiving feedback on my writing. Like a lot of the time, my writing is my self work. Maybe that's not the healthiest thing in the world, but like we're all busy. We're all in this world just trying to be writers, artists. So it's okay if you don't have time for that, but it is useful to do some self-work, self-examination, even like I said, if it's just in the shower or on your commute, in knowing what you want out of a piece, in what you want out of yourself as a writer, and what you want out of a workshop. It takes a lot of reflecting, which is annoying. Time is all we're given, and we don't have a lot of it. But it's good to know if you have the time and commitment, if you where you can commit yourself, and what level of vulnerability you're comfortable with, what level of trust are you comfortable with. If you're going to do a trust fall with your writing, would they be safe in these hands? And I think that's what vulnerability in workshop is, right? It's the combination of blind trust and accepting that other people are well-intended. It's not easy. But with that in mind, if you're interested, the Midwest Writing Center does have a writers group. It's a workshop group, the first and third Saturdays of every month at 11 a.m. Central Time until 1 p.m. Central Time with me. I'm very fun. I'm not. I'm very professional, usually. I've covered my notes on this. I would love, love, love your feedback. I'm gonna see if there's any comments. Oh goodness, there's a lot of comments. Oh, it was 30 minutes ago, but Sherry asked, think of the careful writer who really has no craft. What do you say? That's another opportunity to ask questions of them. Craft is learned. It's hard to believe that. I think sometimes we find ourselves being really I don't know, proud of our talent or believing in our talent, but craft is learned. So asking thoughtful questions about, because I know that writer who is very careful and thoughtful and like gives themselves over to their work and gives themselves over to giving feedback and is thoughtful with you and careful with what they're doing. And they're just not that good. So that's when, and this is hard, it's really hard to pose feedback as questions, but that's I think when the questions are most helpful is with somebody who is really, really trying and is really thoughtful, but isn't doesn't have craft down yet. That's when you want to ask questions of their work. You know, why did you choose this word? What purpose does this sentence use? What if we threw in a little vignette, a little scene to give this some substance? Substance is maybe a difficult word to use, but that's advice I give a lot when I'm reading something where I want something more from it. Um, I ask people, and I give this advice to myself too, because that's where it started. I realized that like my pieces need more scenes because they don't have much grounding them. Um, and when you've got a skeleton of a piece, maybe the writer thinks it's done, but like you said, there's not much craft to it. Um, then let's look at it as a skeleton, as a scaffolding, and say, what kind of wallpaper can we use here? What kind of furniture can we use? I've got an outline of a house, but it doesn't feel like a home. That's a really weird metaphor now that I've said it out loud. But that's the opportunity. I can't believe I'm using the word opportunity. That's when it's, I think, most useful to ask questions as criticism, because then we can allow the writer to lead themselves to learning better writing skills, to honing their talent and their craft. I'm trying to think of a proper example. Chewy, thank you for being here. Things we can keep in mind when giving feedback to other writers grappling with a piece. Ways to be supportive while still trying to elevate. I didn't really know until this how much I prefer asking questions as feedback. Like I didn't realize that about myself until writing these notes and thinking about different ways that I receive and give feedback. And I don't ask questions enough, even though it's my preference. I think it depends, of course, what the person is grappling with. When I'm really struggling with a piece, it's usually because I don't have enough distance from it, or I don't know where it's going. The piece I keep talking about in this video is definitely of that variety, where I'm like, I know where it came from, but I don't know where its destination is. And something that is really helpful to me and something that I like to do when I'm working with other writers is, talk about what is engaging first, or what I appreciate about the piece. Maybe the piece isn't very engaging, but there's an honesty to it, or the artist has a real dedication to it. And so I think it's important to we always talk about the compliment sandwich, right? When we're giving negative feedback. But when, the piece isn't great, or when the struggle isn't totally clear, I think it's important to say, I can see your dedication here. I am in awe of your dedication here, something positive. And then say, I wonder where, this element can go, or I've seen this element in this other writer that I really love. Have you read them? I think giving opportunity, God, I feel very much like like I'm replacing the word problem with opportunity, and that is not at all what I'm doing. But every time I say it, I hear like a robot therapist in my head. This is when we have the opportunity for, I think it's a great opportunity to expand our horizons as the writer, as the writer who's struggling. If I give you my work and I'm like, I don't know what I'm doing, it needs to go somewhere. I care a lot about this piece. Obviously, advice that I would give on that is like, shelve it for a little while, come back. But I've done that. It's been 3 years I've been working on this project and I'm still struggling. I think useful feedback is, hey, I recognize X element. Have you read so-and-so who does that too? Or asking really thoughtful questions, which is hard on the spot. And I'm best on the spot, if I'm honest. I don't always have the time to commit to being thoughtful with a piece if we're not sitting down with it together. Um, so um, try to be as thoughtful as you can while asking questions. Give as many compliments as you can, even if they're vague. And if the struggle isn't something that you can identify with, something that I like to do, because I don't know. I feel like my struggles in my writing are more direction than um, I don't know, like character development or sentence structure. I like to play around with sentences, but those are things that other people struggle with. Then I want to ask questions about what's difficult, and I want to ask questions about you know why this goes here. Um, I hope that was helpful, Chewy. I think that's a really, really great question, and something that I don't think I've put in words before. Giving feedback to somebody who's really, really struggling is difficult, and it depends on a whole bunch of things. Depends on who the person is, especially with you. Who the person is to you, and also the piece. Maybe it's not a style I'm super familiar with, which actually, like, ignorance really opens you up to asking better questions. It's something I really enjoy when I do these videos as interviews. When I don't actually know anything about what we're about to talk about, I think I ask better questions. um, and always, always, always be encouraging. I can't say I've ever met a writer who wasn't meant to be writing. So that's an important thing. Maybe their taste, their style isn't my jam, but we're all storytellers. We really are, as folks who experience life and are involved in the story of ourselves. We're all meant to be here telling our stories. So always keeping that in mind and always reassuring people that they are here and doing the right thing is, well, it's my mission in life. But I think it's really important, especially as a writer who has struggled with my projects. Cool. I'm out of notes here. I'm really excited that y'all had good questions for me today. And also, this is a general, I'll be posting about this a lot later on, but this is a general call for input. I am putting together a Write More Light video with Executive Director Ryan Collins on literary jargon. We're gonna build a lexicon of craft words. I find that a lot of the time when I'm making these videos, I say something and then either someone approaches me later and is like, I don't actually know what that word means, or I'm like mid-sentence and I realize that like that's a word that I know because I've been in this world for so long, like chapbook or workshopping. So general call to action here. Let me know what words you want to find. You can PM me personally. You can email me. You can PM the Writing Center. I'm going to throw my email address in the comments. I just almost gave like a combination of email addresses that wasn't real. I want to know what words that we should define for the general public. There is no reason. I mean, we live particularly, I'm in Iowa, but particularly around college towns, particularly in the writing world, there's a lot of gatekeeping. There's a lot of jargon. There's a lot of academia. There's a lot of snootiness, and storytelling is the oldest thing in human history, and it should be accessible to everyone. So we're going to have a video on that where we define terms. We're going to talk about what voice means, what workshop means, what etc. I have a list going, but I don't know what other people don't know, so let us know. I'm going to get into upcoming events. I'm going to still keep checking the comments, but also, of course, always let us know what you'd like to see, what you want to learn about. Do you want to come on the show and tell me about your project? We're open for it. We want to be a community resource. So community, let us know what resources you need. Upcoming events at the Midwest Writing Center. March 15th. I always do this. I always like look up like I'm panicked. There's nothing behind the computer. It's a wall full of paintings, drawings. March 15th, we have our Journaling for Mental Health workshop with Nami of the Mississippi River Valley. So Nami, the National Alliance for Mental Illness, is collaborating with the Midwest Writing Center to do this workshop. Executive Director Ryan Collins has done this workshop before, but he's including a therapist associated with Nami for this project and Director of Legacy Book Press, Jody Toohey. I'm not directing it. I will be taking the workshop though. We're all going to be learning about journaling for mental health, journaling for creative expression, how it's helpful for our health, how to do it better, how to make it a practice. We've got National Poetry Month is coming up. That's very exciting. March 13th. This is why I should have a calendar behind the camera, but instead it is right here. I'm so sorry about that voice. Yeah. On the 13th, we have our Iron Pen reading. So get excited to hear the winners announced, first of all, and the winners read for the Iron Pen reading. As always, keep a lookout for everything on our social media. We've got lots of posts. Check the newsletters. If you're not signed up for the newsletter, you can do that at mwcqc.org. We do Quint City Poets on Wednesday evenings. I think it's just one Wednesday a month. I'm so sorry. This calendar I'm not looking at is not helping me. Writer's Studio, our workshop group, is the first and third Saturday of the month. There's always more. There's always stuff coming up. Keep in touch. Okay, so that was a little sloppy ending. I know, I apologize. But we have, let's see, on this Thursday, we will have a special guest on Write More Light. That's, again, I know you're sitting here with me now. 1 p.m. Central Time. We will have the editor-in-chief of Hypocrite Reader on to talk about managing a literary magazine and life in the arts, life in writing in an academic setting, in a writing town, etc. Kit is a really, really, really smart woman and a really great resource on how to exist in writing without, having to be part of the upper echelon of capital W writers. Next week on Tuesday, we'll talk about curating a seed catalog. My favorite project title that I came up with, the Seed Journal. Next Thursday, very exciting, author, journalist, and all-around cool dude, Brian Kranz will be on in conversation with our director, Ryan Collins. They are amazing to watch together. Just the chemistry, the dynamic between them. They never run out of anything to say, and they're both just brilliant minds in writing. So that's a great one to be in for. That's next Thursday. Yeah, that's all I've got for you at the moment. So for our workshop today, I would like you to either write on, right? You could do whatever it is, whatever form you do, letters, fiction, poetry, or journal, which is what I usually end up doing, on vulnerability. So I have no idea where my phone is. Oh, it's in my pocket. So I'm gonna set the timer for 5 minutes. And I'm going to write with you. Again, that is not my timer. That is on vulnerability. And here we go. If you're checking out, of course, I hope you write more light into your life. So like I said, I did end up journaling. I kind of expected that I would write a letter. That's my style of choice. And I love it. Maybe I'll do a lesson on that. But I ended up journaling about the importance of vulnerability, as if I haven't spent the last hour talking about it. I think vulnerability is really underrated. It can be so, so helpful, especially as an artist. There's something they talk about in like meditation and yoga called the beginner's mind. And I really wish I'd thought of this prior to planning this video, but if we can manage the same level of vulnerability in workshop as we do in writing, right? The place that we're in when we're writing, I think, is our most honest, most vulnerable place. And if we can manage to have enough trust in our workshop group that we can achieve that level of vulnerability, I think that we're going to get much further, with our art. Very difficult though. Don't want to understate the difficulty of being vulnerable with self versus with other people. For what it's worth, I have no idea how to meditate and I'm very bad at yoga, but that is a really important lesson to take away, I think, in general. Beginner's mind. No shade on people who do, I just don't know how. Every time. I think I pulled something. Okay. Thank you so much for joining me here today. I actually had a really, really great time, even though I was alone. I know I have no shame or qualms about talking about how much better I feel doing these videos with company, but this is a really important lesson. And I don't know, I hope you learned something. I definitely learned something. I just came up with, well, journaling at the end. So as always, write more light into your life.